Awaken your shadow. The truth sets some people free. It offends everyone else. By Seth, the Red Neo, Cherupak.
Chapter 8, Part 2, The Shadow of the Codependent Self.
The codependent self is the shadow of your compassionate self. It carries the same longing to connect, to care, to bridge the gap between souls, but it distorts that longing into people-pleasing, control, micromanagement, self-abandonment, or a combination of these. This isn't compassion, it's compensation. A compulsive need to earn connection by abandoning yourself. The compassionate self gives from overflow. The codependent self wants to avoid abandonment. On the surface, these behaviors seem driven by fear. Fear of rejection, of conflict, of being left behind. Fear that unless you're endlessly agreeable, soft-spoken, and self-sacrificing, you'll be unloved. But fear is not the driver. The real cause is the emotions of grief, shame, guilt, and bitterness. These emotions create stories that summon fear when fear is unnecessary. Shame whispers, "You're unlovable," rooted in the story of a child who learned that being helpful and quiet earned praise while expressing needs brought guilt or withdrawal. Now, as an adult, they equate visibility with rejection. Guilt says, "You let them down." The voice of someone who once chose a career over caregiving and now stretches themselves thin in every relationship, hoping their efforts will erase the feeling of having disappointed themselves and others. Grief mourns, "You'll never be fully met." The ache of someone whose emotional needs were neglected growing up, who now tries to earn affection by becoming indispensable to everyone around them. Bitterness mutters, "No one ever shows up for you." The resentment of the friend who's always available, always generous, but quietly keeps score when that energy isn't returned. These emotions become stories, ones that say, "If I cause no waves, I won't drown," or "If I give enough, they'll stay." Over time, these stories shape the nervous system. Fear doesn't arrive because danger is present. It arrives because the body has been trained to expect pain in the presence of authenticity. It's the echo of old survival strategies, not present reality. And at its core, the codependent self clings to one dangerous idea: if I'm loving enough, I won't be left. This part of you often forms in early environments where love came with conditions. Maybe you were praised for being easygoing, helpful, or quiet. Maybe your anger was punished. Your needs were inconvenient. Your truth was too loud. So you learned to suppress, to smile instead of speak, to offer instead of ask. You internalized a pattern: if I cause no waves, I won't drown. From that belief, a false self emerges, one that anticipates others' emotions before they're even expressed. One that edits truth in real time to avoid discomfort, one that confuses silence with peace and compliance with compassion. This isn't deception, it's survival. Biologically, this maps to a fawning response, the nervous system's strategy for securing safety through appeasement. When the ventral vagal system goes offline and the social field feels unsafe, some systems don't fight or flee, they please, they over-attune, they perform. They smile while their body clenches. They nod while their truth shrinks. This becomes habitual. The body remembers connection requires performance, but this survival strategy eventually becomes a trap. Empathy turns into exhaustion. Attunement becomes self-erasure. You stop offering love and start negotiating it. Every gesture comes with invisible strings. Will this be enough? Will you stay? Will you see me now? This is the self that says yes when it means no. That calls self-abandonment generosity, but quietly hopes someone will notice the cost. That listens endlessly, but never speaks its own truth. That holds space for others, but feels resentment when no one holds space back. Over time, the cost compounds. Suppressed needs harden into silent resentment. The bridge you built to connect becomes a cage you can't rest in. The care you gave to everyone else never finds its way back to you. And still, you keep giving, because you don't know how to stop. The tragedy is that the codependent self often looks virtuous. It plays the role of the peacemaker, the helper, the empath. It makes everything smoother. But underneath, it's driven by a chronic fear of being misunderstood or unloved. It masquerades as kindness, but it's driven by the toxic emotions that summon the guardian of fear when fear is unnecessary. And then the break, the moment when the performance can't hold. The collapse comes from years of swallowed truth, repressed rage, and unmet needs crashing all at once. This isn't a communication issue, it's a nervous system collapse. The system crashes under the weight of its own denial. But even this collapse is an act of the sacred, it's not the end. It's an invitation to heal the codependent self so that the compassionate self is finally invited to rise. But only if you stop equating love with sacrifice. Only if you stop calling martyrdom compassion. Only if you remember that your truth deserves a voice, not just a smile. Because real compassion has structure, it has clarity, it has boundaries. It knows the difference between holding someone and carrying them, between kindness and compliance, between love and performance. Until that distinction is reclaimed, until your yes becomes sovereign, your no becomes sacred, and your enough becomes non-negotiable, the codependent self will keep running the show. It will keep whispering that love must be earned, that safety requires silence, that your truth is too much to be held. But the codependent self rarely operates in isolation. Like a wheel out of alignment, it destabilizes and is destabilized by the shadow selves that come before it. When the insecure self, chapter 5, has not been met with reparenting and somatic safety, the codependent self becomes overactive. It clings to others in search of the stability it never learned to cultivate within. The result is hypervigilant attachment masked as kindness, a distorted generosity rooted not in wholeness, but in scarcity. When the reckless self, chapter 6, is active, the codependent self struggles to maintain coherence. Its efforts to keep the peace are constantly hijacked by impulsive ruptures. The nervous system swings between appeasement and explosion, often mistaking chaos for intimacy and adrenaline for love. Codependence then becomes a performance, not of stability, but of emotional acrobatics. And when the passive self, chapter 7, is left unchecked, the codependent self calcifies into chronic self-erasure. Conflict is avoided at all costs, even when it means disappearing from your own life. The desire to preserve harmony becomes a mask for deep betrayal of your own voice, values, and needs. In this pattern, compassion is weaponized against you. You become nice to the point of extinction. But the inverse is also true. When your secure self is online, the codependent self begins to soften. You find safety in your own body. You know when you're safe and when you're not. You no longer give from fear, you give from a grounded choice. When your adventurous self is active, you stop clinging to familiar pain. You learn to take emotional risks, not to prove your worth, but to expand into real connection. You invite novelty without losing your center. And when your sovereign self is embodied, your boundaries become blessings, not barricades. You speak the truth without apology. You let love in without losing yourself. Compassion becomes structured and intimacy becomes mutual. This is the integrated rhythm and alignment that sets the compassionate self free. And until that rhythm is felt, not just as an idea, but as an embodied reality, the codependent self will keep offering counterfeit peace in exchange for your right to self-actualization and love. This spell is broken not by more giving, but by authorship, by presence, by choosing clearly and courageously to bring the codependent shadow self into the light of consciousness and transfigure it into the manifestation of your divine lover. New subheader: Codependence and the Dark Feminine. The first distortion of the codependent self through the dark feminine is not seduction or collapse, but consumption. This is not the siren's reckless magnetism or the insecure self's silent withdrawal. This is the soft-spoken parasite cloaked in the language of love, service, and care. It doesn't destroy connection outright. It smothers it. This is the devouring feminine. She mothers everyone but herself. She overfunctions in every space, saying yes when she means no, offering energy she doesn't have and calling it love. She wants to be indispensable, not to serve but to survive. Her worth is measured by the amount of herself she can erase for the sake of others. In its most extreme expression, this archetype becomes what Carl Jung called the devouring mother, a figure who nurtures to the point of control, who withholds independence from those she claims to love, not out of malice, but out of unhealed fear. She keeps her children, her partner, her friends emotionally dependent, not because she doesn't love them, but because she fears being unnecessary. Her script sounds like, "After everything I've done for you, I guess I just care too much. I'm fine. I don't need anything. I'll just take care of it myself." This is the self-erasure of the passive self, fused with the emotional control of the insecure self. But here, it manifests as a chronic need to be needed, a relational martyrdom that quietly demands compensation. Every gesture has a hidden price. Every act of service is secretly a test. Every sacrifice is silently tallied. The shadow feminine in codependence doesn't lash out until she's convinced she's done everything right. Then the ledger comes out. Her voice shakes, her eyes narrow. Her love becomes a weapon sharpened on the whetstone of unacknowledged resentment. This is the part of you that loves without ever expressing a need, then explodes when those needs aren't magically met. The part of you that builds intimacy through crisis, only to collapse when things are calm. The part of you that offers help only to remind people of it later as proof of your loyalty and their failure. We see this in Hansel and Gretel. The witch in the candy house is a caricature of maternal generosity, but her warmth is a lure, her nurturing is conditional, her sweetness hides the oven. She feeds to fatten, cares to consume. This is the devouring feminine at her most grotesque, love weaponized as a trap. Like the witch, the devouring mother archetype rarely self-identifies. Her care feels like love to her, and often to her victims. That's what makes it so insidious. It is smothering disguised as service. And the more she gives, the more she resents. Psychologically, this pattern maps closely to enmeshment, an unhealthy style of relational fusion in which emotional boundaries are blurred or erased. Family systems theorist Salvador Minuchin described enmeshment as a dynamic in which family members are overly involved in each other's lives to the detriment of individual autonomy. Children raised in enmeshed environments often struggle to separate their needs from the needs of a parent, particularly a mother who makes her identity dependent on being needed. This creates an internalized belief. If I grow up, she'll fall apart. Research from Dr. Carol McBride, Will I Ever Be Good Enough? 2008, and Dr. Lindsay Gibson, Adult children of emotionally immature parents, 2015, shows that children of emotionally engulfing parents often develop complex trauma responses, including guilt around independence, difficulty identifying their own desires, and a tendency to overfunction in relationships. These are not surface-level personality traits. They are deeply wired somatic patterns rooted in nervous system survival strategies. The nervous system wired for hyperattunement studies others' moods, preempts conflict, keeps the peace, but not from compassion, from fear, from a lifetime of relational conditioning that said, "You are loved only when you are useful. You are safe only when you are invisible. You are valued only when you disappear." This is not humility. It is the pride disguised in the custom of meekness. The cost of this pride is staggering. Emotional burnout, hormonal dysregulation, chronic fatigue, lost friendships, romantic patterns where you become the caretaker, the therapist, the unpaid emotional laborer, until one day you disappear so completely that you no longer recognize your own desires. You don't know what you want, only what others need from you. This is how the compassionate self becomes distorted by shadow. Instead of transmitting care, it performs it. Instead of fostering connection, it manipulates it. Instead of honoring interdependence, it entangles. To heal this pattern, you must be willing to break your own spell, to grieve the years spent earning love through service, to stop keeping score, to stop being the emotional crutch that others lean on so they never have to grow, to stop parenting people who are not your children, to stop giving what you don't have just to avoid being abandoned. You must ask, where have I mistaken sacrifice for love? Where have I made others responsible for my worth? Where have I withheld truth to preserve an illusion of harmony? And you must learn moment by moment to replace appeasement with authenticity, service with selfhood, emotional labor with emotional literacy. This is the turn in consciousness that begins to move you toward. Expelling the dark feminine starts with asking questions that expose the motives driving her impulse to cloak control in the language of caring action. The diagnostic questions below correspond to the mid to high levels in Dr. David Hawkins' scale of consciousness. Neutrality, calibrating at 250. What change am I resisting? The devouring feminine often resists the shift from being needed to being real. In enmeshed relationships, her identity is so fused with caretaking that neutrality feels like abandonment. When you've built your self-worth on self-erasure, neutrality isn't just uncomfortable, it feels dangerous. Yet this is precisely the turning point, the willingness to stop micromanaging others' lives, to let others struggle and grow without intervening. Neutrality asks you to release control masked as care. It means not reacting, not rescuing, not fixing. It is the calm space where you allow others to be sovereign, even when it threatens your role. For those caught in this archetype, neutrality often marks the beginning of true growth, the choice to step back without shutting down, to let go without disappearing. Willingness, calibrating at 310. What can I be more open to? This is the moment the nervous system begins to loosen its grip. In the aftermath of chronic hyperattunement, it is a sacred milestone to soften without collapsing, to receive without contorting, to expand without disappearing. Willingness is not the abandonment of boundaries, it is their reanimation. It is the shift from unconscious obligation to conscious openness. When a child of enmeshment begins to ask for their own space, or when a woman who has overfunctioned her whole life finally lets herself receive support without guilt, this is willingness. This is the compassionate self, remembering that it's allowed to exist, not as a role, but as a presence. The devouring feminine is not evil. She is the compassionate self exiled into performance. She is the secure, adventurous, and sovereign selves distorted by survival and fused into a shell of self-negation. But when you integrate those selves, when your secure self grants safety, your adventurous self reclaims vitality, and your sovereign self reestablishes authorship, something else emerges. Compassion with boundaries, presence without performance, love without attachment. In this clarity, the energy of the devouring feminine begins to transfigure into the energy of the divine lover. The fog lifts, the list of resentments and collected injustices burns, and what's left is true connection, rooted in sovereignty and flowing from abundance. New subheader, Codependence and the Dark Masculine. The false patriarch is the shadow of the compassionate self, the archetype of false fatherhood that promises care but breeds control. This is the archetype behind every authoritarian system that masquerades as compassion: big government overreach, radical left social engineering, woke corporatism, and totalitarian regimes advertising themselves as safety nets for the vulnerable while quietly building cages for the soul. He shows up in the father who demands loyalty but withholds warmth, in the preacher who wields scripture like a blade but forgets the balm, in the coach who breaks boys to make men, in the therapist who bypasses his own shadow while guiding others through theirs, in the bureaucrat who cloaks control in the language of equity and inclusion, in the compassionate politician who offers cradle-to-grave caretaking at the price of freedom, in the street thugs who fly banners reading Antifa while acting, such as in the 2020 Portland riots where federal courthouses were set ablaze, or in Berkeley, where masked agitators violently shut down speakers under the banner of tolerance as brown shirts, destroying property, silencing speech, beating dissenters, and calling it justice. This is the woke father state and its paramilitary enablers that infantilize whole populations and call it progress. The Apostle Paul warned of this dark masculine energy in Colossians 3:21, saying, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children, lest they lose heart." The false patriarch is what happens when this command is ignored, when love becomes leverage and authority substitutes for attunement. It is also what happens when governments become paternalistic, exasperating entire nations, draining initiative, undermining autonomy, and producing despair. He doesn't rage like a tyrant. He bleeds influence through charm, intellect, and performance. But his presence drains rather than nourishes. His charisma evokes admiration, not safety. His words sound like compassion, but echo with a subtle violence, the violence of unmetabolized shame disguised as wisdom. This is the same shadow that animated the compassionate regimes of the 20th century. Mao's China, Stalin's USSR, Pol Pot's Cambodia, all claiming to be the fathers of the people while murdering their children by the tens of millions. The false patriarch doesn't father. He fosters dependency. He doesn't love. He consumes. He doesn't serve. He seduces. In the state, this becomes democide, the systematic killing of one's own citizens. Political scientist R.J. Rummel documented that in the 20th century alone, governments murdered approximately 262 million of their own people through purges, famines, re-education camps, and gulags. By comparison, the next 9 leading causes of premature death, world wars, homicides, starvation, plagues, natural disasters, car accidents, suicides, alcohol-related deaths, and cancers, do not equal this total. Democide eclipsed them all. The archetype of the compassionate father state killed more than the other 9 combined. This is not a political theory. It's based on objective data reflected in the massive body counts of the 20th century, the bloodiest century in history. Mao's Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962, starved an estimated 45 million. Stalin's forced collectivization and gulags killed 20 million. The Khmer Rouge exterminated nearly 25% of Cambodia's population in 4 years. These are not aberrations. They are the logical outcome of the false patriarch scaled to society. We care for you at the price of your freedom. The acts are carried out by what Mark Passio calls order followers in service of evil, people convinced they are saving the world while enforcing its cages. And yes, I'm talking about people who serve in the police and military, who carry out whatever order they're given under the blind rationalization that they're just doing their job. It's easy to look at these people and assume that they would disobey an order if it were proven unconstitutional or immoral, but this assumption was brutally disproven on a global scale during the COVID-19 era. Entire nations surrendered their rights under the banner of public health. Governments enacted sweeping mandates and lockdowns, enforced censorship, froze dissenters' bank accounts, and used corporate collusion to silence opposition. Millions lost businesses, mental health collapsed, families were divided, and the fear of contagion was weaponized to justify unprecedented tyranny. Medical apartheid was rebranded as virtue. Isolation was sold as love. Submission was rebranded as safety. All of it under the guise of compassion. This was not science, it was ideology, and it followed the same psychological blueprint as every authoritarian regime before it. The same woke bureaucracies who chant equity and safety used social media mobs, deplatforming, and state corporate coercion to destroy reputations and livelihoods, always in the name of care. The people enforcing these lockdowns and restrictions claimed that they were just doing their job. In truth, they were carrying out orders that destroyed the freedom and the lives of millions. If these order followers had refused to follow the commands handed down to them by tyrants, the tyrants would have had no power. This proves that it's not tyranny that corrupts and destroys entire societies. The real carnage comes from the compliance of those who follow orders while telling themselves and everyone watching that they have no choice. We always have a choice. What we don't always have is the moral courage to accept that and to act on it. Conformity is truly the deepest and most destructive form of evil. The same is true with the first responders and medical professionals who complied with the orders given to them by social pressure or fear of losing their jobs or their reputations. The bitter irony is that the very cowardice that made them moral in one context, dutifully obeying social norms, clinging to approval, avoiding the risk of standing alone, is the exact cowardice that made them immoral in another. Their morality and their immorality flow from the same root: fear of rejection, fear of punishment, fear of freedom itself. What appeared as virtue in one season became vice in the next, not because the people changed, but because the orders did. As Nietzsche put it, morality is the weakness of the herd, and that same weakness, dressed as virtue, becomes the engine of atrocity the moment power demands it. This is what ideological possession looks like when it wears a white coat or a hashtag. Like any skilled narcissist, it manufactures fear to engineer dependency. It promises safety, then systematically redefines danger. It creates chaos, then offers itself as the solution, so long as you submit. The woke state, like the pathological patriarch, claims to protect you from harm, while quietly grooming you to believe you're helpless without it. It punishes those who dissent, rewards those who comply, and conditions entire populations into a trauma bond with their captors. This is how socialism, communism, and wokeism, ideologies marketed as liberation, become instruments of codependence, not freedom. Not because they serve the weak, but because they create the weakness they claim to heal. The false patriarch in his most modern form no longer wears military regalia. He wears a mask, a lab coat, a slogan, and a virtue signal. He preaches safety, but his gospel is fear. He weaponizes compassion to achieve control, just as Antifa weaponizes anti-fascism to justify fascist tactics. The false patriarch violates the law of correspondence. He broadcasts emotional depth but is fragmented and void within. He projects coherence but is divorced from his own nervous system. He speaks of healing but lives from bypass. He builds audiences, not intimacy. He fathers systems, not sons. Big government programs that infantilize citizens operate on the same nervous system logic as an abusive father. You are safe as long as you comply. Like the devouring mother, the false patriarch operates through enmeshment, but instead of smothering, he seduces. Instead of collapsing, he postures. And the energetic price he demands is not caretaking, but loyalty. In a society, it is your tax, your speech, your body, your mind. Dethroning the false patriarch starts with asking questions that expose the motives driving his thirst for conquest. The diagnostic questions below correspond to the mid to high levels in Dr. David Hawkins's scale of consciousness. Neutrality, calibrating at 250. What truth am I resisting? This is the entry point for dissolving the performance of compassion. Neutrality calls the false patriarch out of his need to dominate through insight and invites him to witness without reacting, to observe without preaching, to let go of being the emotional authority in every room or the moral authority of an entire nation. Here, neutrality is not emotional detachment, it is energetic honesty. It marks the moment he stops managing others' healing journeys and begins confronting his own. Willingness, calibrating at 310, what am I willing to see in myself? This is the shift from performative empathy to embodied openness. Willingness loosens the grip of strategic care and invites spontaneous truth. It is the nervous system beginning to exhale. It allows the false patriarch to admit his own exhaustion, to let go of needing to be the wise one, the strong one, the one who always knows. It is the first moment he receives love without needing to earn it through performance. This is the compassionate self, remembering that it can rest, not in control, but in communion. To dethrone the false patriarch is not to silence the masculine voice or dismantle healthy authority. It is to reroot it in presence. The compassionate self does not manipulate. It meets, it doesn't seduce. It resonates, it doesn't perform, it transmits. The divine lover does not need to convince. He reminds. He does not demand loyalty. He embodies truth. His authority is not extracted. It is offered back by those who feel safe in his presence. This is the restoration of the sacred masculine, not in force, but in frequency. Not in charisma, but in coherence. Not in domination, but in devotion. Here, the kingdom of heaven is restored, not through edicts, but through embodiment. Not through control, but through communion. Not through law, but through the sacred marriage of the true masculine and feminine, aligned with the divine law, and working together in a spirit of harmony and love. New subheader, Wrath as the False Guardian. Wrath rarely arrives with fangs bared. It does not descend like a thunderclap or declare itself with banners. More often it moves like smoke through a cracked foundation, subtle, pervasive, and disguised. It enters the psyche not as a brute force, but as a response to heartbreak, ancient, buried, and unprocessed. The ache of betrayal, the despair of injustice, the soul-cracking silence of love withheld when it was most needed. These ungrieved sorrows do not vanish. They ferment, they mutate. And when the compassionate self is bypassed, when grief is not metabolized, when forgiveness is forced or forbidden, when the wound is denied its voice, wrath moves in like a squatter in an abandoned sanctuary. It masquerades as courage, but it is grief in armor. It is not the guardian who protects, but the false guardian, the punisher, the one who lashes out, not from wholeness, but from the agony of having never been allowed to feel. This false guardian emerges when the heart, meant to be a sanctuary, is militarized, when our inner world, made for communion and resonance, becomes a battlefield of judgment, control, and domination. Wrath is not the sovereign warrior standing for truth. It is the wounded child, armored and armed, seeking retribution for love never received. Like lust cloaks longing in indulgence, wrath cloaks heartbreak in domination. It is performative protection. It promises safety but cannot deliver it because it bypasses the very compassion that makes true safety possible. The demon Azazel represents this possession. His biblical origins lie in the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16, when a scapegoat was sent into the wilderness, symbolically carrying the sins of the people. Azazel became associated with the desolation and expulsion of sin into isolation. But in the soul, Azazel's function evolves. He is the one who weaponizes pain, who distorts the compassionate instincts of the heart into suspicion, bitterness, and righteous cruelty. He whispers, "You've been wronged, therefore you are right to rage." This is how wrath becomes a moral costume. The pain we refuse to grieve calcifies into judgment, and judgment into crusade. The heart chakra, the energetic seat of compassion, union, and mercy, becomes a war room. Its resonance is hijacked, its light dimmed, its field, once capable of profound healing, turns inward and becomes a forge for punishment. The very part of us designed to feel and connect becomes a gavel of judgment and a sword of vengeance. Azazel's access point is always the same, a wound that was denied witness, unprocessed betrayal, abandonment dressed in piety, injustice no one acknowledged. The kind of soul-fracturing silence that tells a child or a lover or a citizen, "Your pain is too inconvenient to matter." When this pain is never seen, never validated, it hardens. And in that hardening, we become vulnerable, not to evil in the abstract, but to the kind of evil that dresses itself in virtue. We see this when those who claim to be protectors become abusers. When fathers use Scripture to control instead of comfort, when therapists wield frameworks instead of presence, when lovers punish instead of attune, when nations justify surveillance, censorship, and coercion in the name of safety. Azazel is not a myth. He is a pattern, a code embedded into the human psyche, waiting to be activated when the conditions are right: heartbreak, isolation, unresolved grief, and a hunger for righteousness untempered by love. What we call demonic possession is actually the calcification of a biological energy pattern. Trauma leaves an imprint in the nervous system. Betrayal isn't just remembered, it is relived, encoded into the amygdala, and played on repeat in the background of consciousness. Hypervigilance becomes a lifestyle. The body floods with cortisol. The adrenal system burns hot, then crashes. Eventually, fatigue sets in, but the mind remains alert, anxious, angry, bracing for the next wound. This is not protection. It is entrapment, and it creates the perfect incubator for wrath. Somatic memory, the body's record of pain, becomes indistinguishable from present experience. The betrayed child, now an adult, feels slighted by a friend and lashes out as if reliving the original trauma. The disappointed believer watches his community choose comfort over courage and responds with rage, not discernment. The activist, burned by systemic injustice, becomes consumed by moral absolutism. In each case, wrath feels like sovereignty, but it is only survival. Performance addiction, the compulsion to prove worth through action, and control addiction, the need to dominate one's environment to avoid perceived chaos, are both versions of this same loop. They mimic the lust addiction cycle: dopamine, shame, suppression, compulsion, but rather than seeking pleasure, the wrath-addicted soul seeks righteousness, justice, or power. And it seeks these not as ends in themselves, but as shields against vulnerability. The result is spiritual amnesia. We forget who we are because we have trained our bodies to be soldiers, not lovers, to brace, not to breathe, to perform, not to receive. This is why wrath, though it feels empowering, actually fragments us. It isolates us from others, and even more dangerously, from our own compassionate self. We become strangers to our own hearts, even as we preach the language of justice. Our authority becomes performance. Our power becomes posturing, and we remain deep within wounded children carrying weapons they do not understand. Scripture offers us mirrors if we dare to look. Cain in Genesis is the first murderer, but he is also the first man to offer worship that was not received. His wrath did not begin with hatred, it began with shame. God accepted Abel's offering, not Cain's. And rather than face the wound, rather than ask, inquire, reflect, Cain turned outward. He redirected his pain into violence. He spilled his brother's blood, not because he was evil, but because he could not bear to feel inferior. This is the root of wrath, unacknowledged shame transmuted into domination. Cain did not kill to protect, he killed to escape, to silence the mirror that Abel held up. His was not a righteous wrath. It was a fire fueled by inferiority. Contrast this with Christ in the temple. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, it was not reactivity, it was sovereignty. His action was surgical, not scattershot, grounded, not chaotic. He braided a whip, an act of deliberation, and drove out corruption in alignment with divine law. There was no flailing, no self-righteous monologue, no adrenaline-fueled outburst. His wrath was not personal, but prophetic. Not born of unhealed wounds, but rooted in divine coherence. This distinction matters. Righteous anger arises from the ground of love. It burns clean. It purifies. It clears the way. Egoic wrath arises from bypassed pain. It obscures. It fractures. It burns indiscriminately. You can tell the difference by observing the tone, the timing, and the target. Righteous anger restores boundaries. Wrath breaks them. One is a call to order, the other is a cry for control. When we confuse these, we mistake judgment for virtue, passion for principle, and violence for justice. But as Paul warned in Ephesians, be angry, but do not sin. The implication is clear. Anger is not the problem. Possession is. This progression is not abstract, it is anatomical, psychological, and political. When unresolved grief is exiled from the heart, wrath moves in to fill the vacuum. It impersonates strength, weaponizes pain, and builds its throne where compassion should have reigned. This isn't just the story of a person consumed by rage, it's the architecture of spiritual possession. Azazel doesn't just torment individuals, he engineers systems, families, institutions, nations, all bearing the same signature, control dressed as care, punishment masquerading as protection, and wrath enthroned in the sacred seat of love. This false guardian appears most often in the form of wrath, a fiery counterfeit to the secure masculine presence. He arrives when the heart has been hollowed of compassion, and the seat of sovereignty becomes a throne for vengeance instead of discernment. Wrath is not the flame of justice, but the wildfire of unresolved fear, consuming all in its path and justifying the ruin as righteousness. It takes the voice that should be guarding truth and twists it into a weapon of domination, silencing opposition not with wisdom but with volume, violence, or veiled threats. When the heart chakra, the energetic center meant to harmonize masculine and feminine, is hijacked by the unresolved wound of betrayal or humiliation, wrath rushes in to defend what's left of the self. But it is not a true guardian. It is a warlord in stolen armor. It impersonates the secure self, posturing with strength while secretly hollowed out by fear. This is the path of Azazel, the spirit named in Leviticus and later demonized in Jewish mysticism as the scapegoat-bearing entity of the wilderness. Azazel represents the transfer of sin, the dumping ground for what cannot be owned. And when the heart refuses to feel, When it cannot metabolize pain through compassion, it projects it. It casts it out. It finds a scapegoat. The possessed heart becomes a courtroom, but no longer one ruled by divine justice. It is ruled by grievance. Every wound becomes evidence. Every slight becomes a charge. But instead of restoration, this court only delivers punishment. Wrath makes the soul its own accuser, judge, and executioner, and then trains it to project that court onto everyone else. This is why rage often feels righteous. It borrows the symbols of strength, like justice or protection, but serves a different master. This wrath is not the strength of Jesus overturning tables to purify the temple. It is the wrath of Cain who slays Abel not out of conviction but resentment. He was not accepted. His offering was not enough. And instead of turning inward to heal, Cain turns outward to punish. This is how wrath deceives. It promises protection, but delivers persecution. It punishes the persecuted by inflicting external judgment, rejection, and violence. But the persecutor also suffers, poisoning their own body, mind, and spirit with the toxic cocktail of vengeance disguised as justice. Biologically, wrath emerges when the sympathetic nervous system stays locked in activation without a path to resolution. Compassion, when present, creates a space where threat can be named, owned, and released. But when compassion is bypassed, when the heart closes, wrath hardens the body like armor, muscles tense, breath shortens, eyes narrow. Blood rushes to the limbs, preparing for war. This state, if prolonged, becomes the body's default. The man possessed by wrath is not just mentally agitated, he is chemically possessed. Cortisol floods his bloodstream, his immune system downshifts. His brain reconfigures its pathways for threat recognition instead of creative vision. His soul begins to die of inflammation. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is cellular theology. The spiritual wound becomes biological bondage. Chronic wrath reshapes the nervous system into a war machine that cannot rest unless someone is losing. And if no enemy is available, the self will suffice. This is how wrath mimics love. It convinces the wounded masculine that control is care, that power is protection, that obedience is order. But these are not the fruits of love. They are the bribes of tyranny. And in a world addicted to false security, tyranny always finds a home. Political systems manufacture wrath through manufactured fear. They warn of enemies at the gate, of unseen threats, of the other who must be stopped to preserve our way of life. It is always for our safety. Just as a narcissistic father wounds his children under the guise of discipline and protection, tyrannical systems weaponize wrath to control populations. They promise safety while offering only surveillance. They offer order while demanding obedience. The more unstable the world becomes, the more wrath is broadcast as strength. And the more trauma remains unresolved in the collective body, the more eager we are to serve wrath as if it were justice. This is why ideologies on both the far right and the far left traffic in outrage. From the streets to the screens, wrath has become the default signal of moral authority. The louder the protest, the more justified the cause appears. But wrath rarely births wisdom. It calcifies positions. It destroys dialogue. It turns sacred values into weapons and human beings into avatars of blame. And nowhere is this clearer than in movements that preach compassion but act in violence. Antifa, for example, claims to stand against fascism, but it does so through black masks, broken windows, and mob tactics that mirror the very authoritarianism it claims to oppose. This is not compassion. This is Azazel in the heart center, possessing wounded young men with unresolved rage and giving them a banner under which to destroy. It is the wrath of the abandoned son dressed up in political drag. The cultural shift toward totalitarian thought, what some call wokeism, follows a similar arc. It begins in the language of protection, of safe spaces, of not causing harm, but safety, when weaponized, becomes a cage. Language is policed, thought is surveilled, dissent is rebranded as violence. In this new moral order, you are not allowed to be wrong. You are cast out for being unsafe. It is not enough to behave. You must believe, and you must believe in public, or you will be punished. This mimics the behavior of an abuser. The tyrant father demands his children align not only in action but in thought. He must be worshipped, or he will withdraw love, or worse, he will strike. This is not spiritual correction. This is spiritual possession, an energetic hijacking of the compassionate self by the distorted masculine, where the drive to protect becomes corrupted by the need to control. Just as earlier forms of possession in this text described lust as the parasitic override of longing and sloth as the sedation of sovereignty, here wrath possesses the heart by reprogramming the energetic center of love into a command post for judgment. What once served as the seat of communion becomes the throne of retribution, and the person in its grip does not simply feel anger, they become the wrath. It speaks through them, acts through them, and justifies its own harm as moral necessity. This is Azazel's strategy, to convince the wounded soul that domination is the only path to safety. The person in its grip believes they are protecting others, but what they are truly protecting is their unhealed pain. And like all false guardians, wrath creates dependency, not only emotionally, but ideologically. It convinces the wounded that safety lies in submission to the system that harmed them. It conditions them to believe that liberation is dangerous and that conformity is compassion. This dependency ensures that even dissent is framed within the boundaries of the approved narrative, reinforcing the same cycle of control that birthed the wound in the first place. Victims of wrath-based systems are taught that safety can only be secured through conformity. Obey the rules, repeat the slogans, hate the enemy. This is not moral evolution. It is fear-based tribalism. It mimics religion but lacks redemption. It mimics compassion but lacks courage. It mimics justice but knows nothing of mercy. And this is how the heart, meant to be the throne of compassion, becomes a prison of ideology, where wrath not only governs behavior but shapes belief itself. When even our yearning for truth is hijacked by unhealed wounds, we do not awaken, we double down. We do not liberate, we loop. And until the true guardian returns, until the compassionate self is restored to the seat of sovereignty, we will remain ruled not by love, but by the shadows that impersonate it. Throughout history, some of the world's most celebrated minds followed this patterned descent into madness, black and white thinking overriding emotional integration, and brilliance collapsing into literal mental breakdown. It starts in the mind, then moves to the nervous system, and finally, the soul. The entire mind-body complex rapidly crumbles under the weight of a mind that carries and processes the contents of its thoughts only in broad, black and white categories, right and wrong, good and evil, devils and angels. History is full of examples of this patterned collapse of the brilliant but tragic perfectionist. Consider Friedrich Nietzsche, whose fiery dialectics, God versus nothingness, Übermensch versus herd, made him a philosophical titan, but also left him stranded in the void between them. Unable to hold contradiction, his genius imploded into madness. His inability to metabolize paradox did not just isolate him, it consumed him. So too with Isaac Newton, whose binary vision of truth and heresy drove revolutionary discoveries in physics, but whose absolutism fostered paranoia and bitter theological obsessions, or Arthur Schopenhauer, whose view of life as suffering left no room for mystery, play, or joy. His clarity came at the cost of communion. Ludwig van Beethoven, tormented by deafness and perfectionism, saw his life through extremes, either a divine mission or utter failure. The same fire that fueled his compositions also scorched his peace. Nikola Tesla's obsessions followed suit, pure, uncompromising, otherworldly, and ultimately led him into isolation and hallucinations. Émile Cioran distilled despair into genius, but confessed that his black and white vision made him an insomniac prisoner of his own mind. What unites these men is not only greatness, but a psychic architecture that could not tolerate gray. And in that intolerance, their brilliance burned too hot to hold. They cracked under the pressure of their own binary logic. Each became, in a sense, possessed, not by spirits, but by ideas so totalizing they left no space for ambiguity, no sanctuary for rest. This is the danger of wrath-infused ideologies. They grant the illusion of moral clarity while erasing the capacity for nuance. They promise safety, but banish paradox. And when paradox is banished, madness often follows, because to live in the heart is to live in tension. It is to hold contradiction without collapse. But wrath refuses tension. It demands a verdict. And so, just as wrath distorts the heart's capacity for compassion into crusade, it also rewires the mind's capacity for discernment into dogma. What results is not strength, but fracture, not clarity, but collapse, not truth, but obsession. To reclaim the heart is not to renounce anger. It is to reclaim grief, to metabolize the heartbreak that wrath disguises. Only then can anger become clean fire again, one that warms rather than devours. Only then can the compassionate self return to the throne, not as a judge, but as a healer. And only then can we stop mistaking possession for power and begin remembering what it means to be whole.
End of Chapter 8, Part 2 of Awaken Your Shadow by Seth Chairpack.